It's the Elephant in the Dome, the official podcast of the Washington State Senate Republican Caucus. I'm Trace Ellis with Senate Republican leader John Braun, and wrapping up the 2026 legislative session. And oh my, what a session it was. Obviously, the big thing that happened this session, we've talked a lot about it, and we probably will talk about it a lot more, is the income tax. One of the biggest bills that I've ever seen pass the legislature. Can you think of many bigger than that?
None in my time in the legislature, and none I can think of, certainly in the last 3 or 4 decades, maybe longer. That would go past my memory of legislative activities. But, this is a bill that is, assuming the governor signs it, and he certainly seems willing to do so, unfortunately, that's going to have long-term negative impact on our state's economy, opportunity for folks to work in our state. I mean, it goes on, and it was rushed through in a 60-day session without, reasonable regard for the impact on businesses and our economic climate. And I think barring some unexpected act from the governor or, and of course, subject to some legal review likely, and maybe even a vote of the people, this is basically a train wreck coming at us.
Why now? Why do you think the Democrats need to do this? You kind of have two schools of thought on this. There are some Democrats who say we need to fix the tax code. It's regressive. And, we've talked about that before, and we don't have to get into a big debate about whether or not it's regressive. But some say it's just the tax code needs to be fixed. But others seem to indicate that, hey, we just need more money. Which one do you think it is?
Well, I think it's some of both. I think, they at least they try to give themselves cover by saying we need to fix the tax code. Of course, this bill does nothing to do that, not in any real sense. I mean, if you want to fix the tax code, you can't just add billions of dollars in new taxes and hope for the best. And it does have some meager tax reduction, but mostly it just spends money. And that's, I think, the real driver. Certainly, for a lot of the folks in the Democratic caucus, they could check off kind of a progressive goal, but they've gotten themselves in this runaway budget situation because they can't seem to control their spending, and this allows them to check off a progressive goal and get more buckets of money that they think they can spend more wisely than the private sector.
Well, one of the senators, one of the Democrat senators who's pushing this says, "Oh, trust me, I'm going to get after this regressive nature of our tax code. You could trust me. Come on board. Be part of my committee that deals with this." She seems like she's serious, that she does want to get after it. Do you think there will be some reductions in the future of taxes like B&O taxes, sales taxes, property taxes that are all very regressive?
Yeah, I found that entire speech somewhat frustrating. She's serious. There's no question about that. But what she's serious about is taking more money from the private sector. She has never wavered in her willingness to add more taxes and has never in any meaningful way tried to reduce taxes. And the idea of being on a committee with her is nonsense. She ran a statewide tax review committee for nearly 3 years, wrapped up just a couple years ago. That committee unequivocally came to the conclusion after meetings around the state with all communities across our state, unequivocally said nobody wants an income tax. And yet, having chaired that for 3 years, listened carefully to people of the state of Washington, she completely ignored it. So I don't think there's many people, at least on our side of the aisle, who are anxious to be on a committee with her because they have no faith that she's really there to make the situation better. What she's shown over and over again is that she's 100% committed to this progressive idea of more and more taxes and class warfare used to justify them.
We should say that Senator Keith Wegener was the co-chair in that committee, served in good faith. I interviewed him a couple times during that whole process. He said, he goes, it's interesting because this is what we're hearing. People do get frustrated with the amount of taxes they're paying, but nobody seems to want an income tax. At the end of it, like you said, here we are with an income tax. It was like, what was the point of the committee, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, if you're genuine and you want to listen to citizens and you spend all that time and money, frankly, to get around the state, you'd listen and not and act on what you learned. And in fact, they did exactly the opposite.
Beyond the income tax, there were some other bills that I know you were really concerned about. One that Republicans ended up defeating that you think is maybe the biggest win for Republicans this legislative session. What was that?
The one I've highlighted has been the bill that would allow unionization within the agricultural sector, and some people will shrug and say, "Well, isn't that allowed already?" And the reality is it's not. And this bill not only would have allowed that, it would have allowed it in a way that would have been enormously harmful to our ag sector. And some people don't realize that, especially here on the west side of the state, how big an agricultural state Washington is. We're one of the top producers of many agricultural commodities in the country, in some cases in the world, and that we're having trouble. I mean, our ag sector is large, but it's struggling. Right now we're the lowest performing agricultural economy in the country, and that has everything to do with additional regulations, additional taxes that have been placed on them by the Democratic majority. And this would have been just one more cut that would have put them further underground. So this is a big deal. It hasn't been brought up because it doesn't make sense for this group. There's not a demand from agricultural workers. This is really driven by a handful of activists, but it was a real threat, and I was very pleased that we were able to stop it in the Senate.
You've never come off to me as being someone who's anti-union necessarily, and been supportive of unions at some times. But, in this particular case, you feel like it just didn't make sense. Is that kind of why you were against this?
Yeah, I mean, the challenge so there's two things. One, and you're right, I think we should support workers, whether they're unionized or not unionized. We should work for the best conditions for them. But this is a bill that, one, didn't really do that wasn't being asked for or demanded by people working in ag. And we've seen that a few times in recent years where the majority thought they had policy that would help ag workers, when in fact we've had ag workers show up time and time again and say, no, it's not helping me. It's making it more difficult for me to work in this sector and to provide for my family. That's exactly the case here. This was a small group of activists who wanted to do this, would have potentially done great harm to our ag economy, including ag workers. And I think that's why ultimately we were able to stop it, is because at least some folks in the majority caucus listened carefully and heard and understood that this is a very tough thing in an agriculture economy where you're a price taker. You can't really there's no effective way to pass cost increases on to the customer directly, and you have to run a very efficient organization. And running that organization in partnership with your labor folks is the key. And we don't need to divide our labor and management and agriculture to be successful. We've been very successful in Washington State up until recently, exactly the way we are.
Beyond those two issues, income tax and unionized agricultural workers, what jumps out at you about this session, either good or bad?
I'd mention two things. One, we've talked about a lot before, so I'm not going to go too deep in it, but the operating budget is a big problem in that it spends way beyond our revenue. I think and drains the rainy day fund, when in fact we are not in a rainy day. Our economy, while it has slowed, it is not negative. It's actually still growing, but we need that rainy day fund someday. It also projects growth in a way that's just 100% unrealistic. It's likely going to end up with a huge deficit in the future, and that's going to be a real big problem. The other kind of policy bill I'd highlight that it died actually in the House. It got out of the Senate. We fought it pretty hard. It got out of the Senate is what they call the Environmental Crimes Bill, and this was a bill I was very worried about. I'd say probably as worried about as the ag unionization bill. It's a bill that would essentially make a felon of someone who was building something and made an honest mistake. And that could be a blue-collar worker, frontline. It could be somebody that made a decision. But in our state, where we already have some of the best and I'd argue the best environmental laws in the country, it just doesn't make sense to do this. It would put enormous risk into building things when we need to be building things. And I think you'd find a direct decline in investment to build, whether it's residential housing or commercial buildings, or maybe most important right now, additional electrical generation. All these things would be affected by this, would have been affected by that bill, would have put a real damper on building in Washington, would have hurt our economy, and would have hurt our ability to build out of the real challenges we have when it comes to housing or energy supply.
What about law enforcement? We heard during the session that this bill passed last year that Senator Holy was kind of behind and the governor got behind to hire more law enforcement, really hasn't resulted in more law enforcement getting hired. Then it seemed like there was a bit of an attack on law enforcement, especially elected sheriffs this session. What do you make of that?
We have a majority that's still very anti-law enforcement. They've stopped saying the defund police thing because that was politically unpopular, but they're going out after the same thing, just different ways. I mean, it was just only thanks to the governor's support that we were able to get that bill with some additional money for hiring law enforcement out of the legislature. But by the time it got out, it had been weakened so much that many of us expected exactly what we've gotten, which is it's not being executed. It's not resulting in any new hires. It's really not moving the bubble in any manner. And that's exactly what the Democratic majority had hoped for. They thought they had diluted it enough that maybe it wouldn't work at all, because they continue to be committed, in my mind at least, to reducing the number of law enforcement in our state, even though we're already the lowest in the country. So that's a big problem. And then you mentioned it, there was what we call the anti-sheriff bill that it did pass, unfortunately, did pass both chambers after long fights in both chambers, but it would allow an unelected board to remove an elected sheriff. And I just think that's entirely wrong-headed. This is a position that's spelled out in the Constitution. There are already clear mechanisms for removing a sheriff if there's misbehavior in any fashion. They can be recalled by a vote of the people, or they can also just be replaced in a normal, every 4 years they come up for election. So the idea that we had to have an additional unelected body to provide oversight just never made sense. And the other side would make the claim, well, it also sets some standards for qualification for the sheriff. But what they don't acknowledge is there was some agreement on that. There was a separate bill that did that. There were law enforcement organizations that supported that. What they didn't support, and I agree with them, was this idea that unelected body could remove an elected sheriff. That's up to the voters. The voters should be doing that, and them alone.
At the same time, the Democrats here at Olympia seem to be giving more power to the Attorney General here in the state of Washington. I really don't understand this bill. Maybe you can explain it a little bit and explain why it has so many people worried.
Just gives the Attorney General the right to kind of wade into private enterprise and demand additional information. And we did improve it both in the Senate and the House somewhat, so there's additional limits on what they can demand and some additional standards on which they could demand it. But it's still a big threat to private enterprise around the state. I mean, the reality is, the Attorney General has hundreds of attorneys. They got unlimited, relatively unlimited sources of revenue. They can wade in and basically just harass businesses until they can't survive. Again, our businesses are already struggling in Washington State due to the high tax load, due to the high regulatory requirements. The last thing is this kind of this additional authority with Attorney General to go after businesses who may or may not be doing anything wrong, who without sufficient legal safeguards. And what they don't seem to understand is, this is essentially, free money for the Attorney General, but every business that has to explain themselves, has to defend themselves, has to go hire legal counsel, and that gets very expensive very quick, and it makes it just one more thing that is unattractive about doing business in the state of Washington. It's going to contribute to all the other things that are having businesses across our state think hard about whether they want to continue to be here in Washington or not. And if too many decide they do not wish to stay here, which I'm worried that's the direction we're headed, and that could be an enormous harm done to our economy and therefore revenue for the state and therefore services provided by the state.
Somebody listening to this right now may say, wow, it sounds to me like it was Olympia knows best and businesses are bad. If there was a theme to the session, would that be something that you might pick as the theme?
I think you pretty much nailed it. You might say, they like to use the word villain instead of bad, and they might just expand it, not just businesses, but any citizens with any means are all bad. It's class warfare and warfare against businesses when it comes to the Democratic majority.
That's Senator John Braun. I'm Tracy Ellis. This is the Elephant in the Dome, the official podcast of the Washington State Senate Republican Caucus.